Thank you for joining me today to discuss the decision-making of Kenneth Lewis, the problems that he encountered with Bank of America, specifically the purchase of Merrill Lynch. In 1969, Kenneth Lewis graduated from Georgia State University with a finance degree. He spent his time in college working in accounting, and he also worked as a ticket taker for a local airlines. After graduating from Georgia State University, he moved on and started a career with North Carolina National Bank. North Carolina National Bank was merged with and acquired different banks and became what we now know as Bank of America. This was his first job right out of college. He worked his way up, beginning as a credit analyst, all the way through to Chief Operations Officer in 1999, where he worked directly under the CEO, Mr. McCall, and in 2001, Mr. McCall chose Kenneth Lewis to become the new CEO, his heir apparent. He stayed in that position until 2009 when he retired under pressure. As Chief Operating Officer, one of the big things that Mr. Lewis did to further his career and to help the company that he was working for was he was a big part of the acquisitions team. There were multiple acquisitions when he was working with Mr. McCall, but on his way up, he was kind of in the shadows behind Mr. McCall. So when he took over, he decided that he was going to pursue a strategy of acquisition similar to what had been in the past. And these ultimately led to his demise and the poor decision-making we're looking at today. Of the acquisitions that he made, there were 4 specific ones that were pretty big and created part of the issue. Fleet Boston Financial Corp. Was purchased in 2003 for $47 billion. MBNA, the credit card company, was purchased in 2005 for $25 billion. In 2008, Mr. Lewis oversaw the purchase of Countrywide Financial Corp. For $4 billion, and this would have happened right at the beginning of the 2008 financial crisis. And the acquisition that ultimately ended his career, Merrill Lynch, was purchased in 2008 for $50 billion. Coming from the operations side of the bank, Mr. Lewis was more focused on processes than on people. The acquisition strategies that he would go after involved bringing in these new companies and slashing expenses to increase profitability, which is a normal standard for acquisitions, but without having the emotional intelligence and the feel for people, it becomes very difficult if you're the only one making those decisions. Another weakness that Mr. Lewis displayed in his leadership style is he was not willing to tolerate people telling him no and not agreeing with him. One of the first things he did was he removed all of the people in his executive leadership team that didn't agree with him and instead filled it with people who were yes men. He knew how to be a banker, he knew how to acquire new companies, but he didn't know how to lead people. The purchase of Merrill Lynch was flawed from the beginning. There was a rushed due diligence process where Mr. Lewis didn't have the time to dig into all the details of such a large acquisition. He agreed to buy Merrill Lynch on September 15th, 2008. That's an important date because not long after that, Merrill Lynch posted a $15.84 billion loss in that fourth quarter immediately following. Merrill Lynch paid out right before the losses were announced, $3.62 billion to executives as bonuses. Following the purchase of Merrill Lynch, Bank of America had to take $20 billion in federal bailout money. Again, the purchase was announced on September 15th. The vote was in December of 2008, and in January of 2009, Bank of America needed $20 billion as it was on the verge of collapse and it was deemed too big to fail. As more information came out, he lied to investigators, to Congress, to shareholders, and to the public about the events that happened. He stated he didn't know that they were paying out the bonuses. He also stated he didn't know the loss was happening. In the end, after a lawsuit, it was found that he was responsible, and he ultimately paid $10 million personally to resolve the lawsuit. He was also barred from banking or working for any publicly held corporation for 3 years. There are 3 key decision failures here that we can see as we look back through this purchase. One of the things that Mr. Lewis failed to do was he failed to stay with what he knew. Now, that doesn't mean we can't make decisions that push us forward, but when we're making quick decisions and big decisions, we need to make sure we have an understanding. Countrywide was purchased right before Merrill Lynch a few months earlier, and Countrywide was a mortgage lender, not a bank. Now, while it seems that those two would be very similar, there's a significant difference in how the operations are run. Merrill Lynch, like Countrywide, was not a normal bank. It was an investment bank, so things were run differently, and those were not taken into account during this purchase period. So the previous experience that he had in acquisitions was no longer helpful to what he was doing. There was no way he was going to be able to apply that going forward. He also ignored past failures. After having trouble with investment banking in the division that they had already at Bank of America, in 1 year before the acquisition, he was quoted as saying, "I've had all the fun I can stand in investment banking. They took too many losses," and he didn't want to do it anymore. Fast forward another year, instead of remembering his past failures, he jumped right into a giant Merrill Lynch failure. And the last point here is that he failed in ethics. He didn't disclose the bonuses properly. He lied to the government. He lied to the government and told them he wasn't going to purchase the bank. And then he lied to the public and told the public that the government forced him to purchase the bank. And through the entire thing, he took no personal responsibility in any of this. Even down to the lawsuit that was settled, his statement was that he was proud of the work he had done, and he was settling this to move this behind him so he could enjoy his retirement. The decisions that we make affect more than just us. They affect those around us, and some have even further reaching consequences. Specific to Mr. Lewis's purchase of Merrill Lynch, there were 4 different areas here that show some of the effects that were had. Shareholders lost billions in market value. On the 19th of September 2008, the stock price for Bank of America was $38.54. On the 9th of March, it was $3.22. That's such a dramatic turnaround. The $20 billion that Bank of America used was taxpayer money. He was putting taxpayers on the hook for his decision failures. This was needed because of that stock price decline. The capital levels were very low. The government needed to interject this capital to be able to keep the bank solvent and to allow the banking system as a whole to continue to function, as Bank of America was deemed too large to fail. There was a loss of trust in banking executives. Senator Elizabeth Warren went out of her way to use Lewis as an example of what was wrong in the banking industry, and instead of fixing the processes or identifying the people who were broken, she was using this as a loudspeaker for everyone to hear how bad banking executives were. There were stories all over the place in the news in 2008 and 2009 about how horrible bankers were and all of the bad things that were happening in the banking world. I recall personally being a CFO in 2008, getting calls from my customers. Now, we are not a multi-billion-dollar bank. We were a very small community bank at the time, which we still are. And customers would call asking if we were doing these same things, if their money was safe with us, if we were going to fail. And it took a lot of time to help our customers understand that we were different, that we really focused on doing things the right way, on making safe, ethical decisions instead of going outside of the box and doing crazy things like Mr. Lewis had done here. So not only did he affect his current shareholders, but the ripple effect of his poor decision making was felt all the way in a small town in Iowa as I was fielding calls from concerned customers. Well, there are a lot of things that Mr. Lewis could have done to have seen the error in his ways and come up with some better solutions. Looking at a few specific models from the various readings that we have, there were two things that really jumped out at me. One of them is something as simple as using the 6-hat model could have really changed how the entire course happened. And I wanted to focus specifically on two different areas. The white hat would be the data, looking at the data available, and using that white hat, if he has had somebody with him looking at the data available, he would have seen that they were showing losses that were so far beyond what Bank of America could handle. He would have seen the various issues that were coming up, and he would have been able to see that this probably wasn't the best decision for his company. Again, using this the 6-hat model, using the red hat, he could have seen the effects that this would have, especially the fact that he was having to conceal information from his board and from the shareholders. He was concealing information from the government. If he had looked at the emotions that were going to be happening, that the people that were going to be hurt, he would have seen right away that this was probably not the best decision to have made. The other thing he could have done is spent 3 seconds thinking about ethics, and he would have seen that this was an absolute failure from the beginning. Anytime you have to hide and lie and conceal, you're probably not in the right place to be making an ethical decision making. Looking through the 5 principles of common morality, autonomy, non-malfeasance, beneficence, justice, and fidelity, Mr. Lewis has failed on every one of these during this decision-making process. Using ethics as a tool for decision-making would have allowed him to see right away that he was not where he needed to be, and that this probably wasn't the right decision for his company. Mr. Lewis did not make a good decision. If he had taken a few seconds and looked at it from an ethics perspective, that would have been easily identified. If he would have looked at it from a data perspective, it would have been relatively easy to identify. But since he did neither, he made a terrible decision. And this decision affected those close to him. It affected the employees who had their retirement in Bank of America stock. It affected his shareholders who lost a considerable amount of money over that time. But it also affected those far away from him. It affected the taxpayers who had to be there to bail Bank of America out. It affected the small banker in rural Iowa who had to answer questions from his customers. And it affected his customers who had to worry about whether their life savings was going to be safe. A simple bad decision can have a ripple effect through the entire society, just like a good decision can. And until we apply decision-making models and ethics, we run the risk of causing a much greater ripple than we intend. But narrowing it down and making the right decisions could have prevented this. But overall, Mr. Lewis is a great example of a bad idea.